let's talk about, why we might want to even consider why am I interested in tall buildings against the relative environmental impact of tall buildings against small buildings. So we've seen this population curve a million times. I think what's important, and Luke pointed it out, is that the population growth it's not so much that people are breeding more, it's just people are dying less, which is actually a good thing, I think. But we're currently at the peak of the growth rate. The population is around about 7.3 billion, and it's not going to start to stabilize until kind of around 2050, when it's 9.5 billion. And by that time, that's a lot of people on the planet. It's 25% more than there are right now. But it's not just about the number of people; it's where they are. And I'm sure a couple of years ago when they announced, well, for the first time in history, more than 50% of the global population is living in cities. Well, now it's up to almost 55%. It's huge, and again, supporting what Lucas said, it's cities that are growing. People move to cities for good reason. It provides better healthcare, better access to jobs, more likelihood of education. So people do live longer in cities, and people move into cities, and it's very clear here that well over half of the planet is heavily urbanized. So this is one consequence of urbanization, and everybody seemed to mention Naperville, so I have to mention Naperville because that's actually where I live, just outside of Chicago. This is not Naperville, but this is pretty much what it could look like. It's a typical suburban city that these exist everywhere in the world, and this is the antithesis of density. This is the opposite. 2.5 people per home, 2 cars, well, 1.8 according to Anthony. So in looking at my study, I didn't just want to, the study is about the carbon emissions primarily. We're going to equate everything back to carbon. But there are a whole bunch of issues that urbanization does cause, as you guys are all aware. I'm going to tackle greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions, but we shouldn't lose track of the fact that as we urbanize, we lose agricultural land. And it's almost very, very counterintuitive. We're a very illogical species. We actually expand into agricultural land and then actually diminish our ability to produce food for our expanded population to eat, which is just very, very strange. But we also need to tackle issues like energy security, and water management is a very major challenge. But back to this study, and I like this quote from George Bernard Shaw, who you don't know, he's was a famous Irish playwright. And the answer to the question about what's better, a small, low-rise urban, suburban development or tall building development, it seems obvious to us in the room because we're all mainly on board with it. But if I was to go to a different audience, they would say, well, it's obviously a bad thing. Why would you want to do that? So often asking this simple question is a really, really complicated answer, and you think it's obvious, and it is absolutely far from obvious, the answer. And so to try to help address it, I'm looking at energy demand, we're looking at land use, we're looking at transportation, and we're looking at overall life cycle analysis of different communities. And with that, I can start to tell you about the study. Right. So our study at AS plus GG took a very different approach to Anthony's. There's quite a few studies that would look to compare existing buildings, which is a great approach. The problem is, unless they were built according to the same building code, using the same materials, in the same climatic zone, with the same population demographic, you're never going to be comparing apples to apples. You're always going to have to start to try to make some allowance or add some kind of factor that would compare it. So our study looked at, we took a step back and figured out, okay, why should we bother comparing existing buildings? We're a design company. We design buildings for our business. Let's start from first principles. And that is, we wanted to study 2,000 residential units. They could all be in one super tall tower, 210 stories or so, or they could be in 2,000 single-family homes in an American suburb. There could be in 2,000 single-family homes in the actual city, or we could divvy it up any way. We came up with 9 different building typologies, all of which hold 2,000 residential units. We stuck just to residential. I know in a way that's kind of not realistic. These would probably have some kind of other program at the bottom of them and what have you, but the idea is we're looking towards perhaps addressing the answer to a global question, which is, should people live in denser communities? And that's why we picked residential. Now, there were 2 ways to do this study. When it comes to, say, picking the apartment size, you have to have an apartment size. So what we did was we went out to the real estate market in Chicago, and let me just step back. Within Chicago, these typologies exist. These 2 do not. There are no residential towers in Chicago, not even close to that height. But we were able to, based on things like Trump Tower and what have you, come up with a typical average apartment size for each building. So we've got 2 different parallel tracks on this study. One is using a market baseline apartment size. So the suburban family homes would be round about 200 square meters for the entire home. These were about 150 square meters. These smaller buildings are only about 80 square meters. So that was approach 1, and let's just call that our base typology. We then took another approach running in parallel where the apartment sizes in all of these were identical. So we averaged it, we redesigned the buildings to be 150 square meter apartments. So just so that's in mind, I'll be talking about 2 parallel approaches that we did. So we did the entire study twice, one with market-sized units and one with 150 square meter units. And it's important to do that because the apples-to-apples comparison has to have the same apartment size. But the reality is that these buildings are not going to be nobody's going to live in something like this that's 200 meter apartment size. It's way too big. So here you see just the table that defines our 9 different building typologies. And now let me just say that each of these buildings was designed to meet ASHRAE 90.1 2010 energy code from a performance perspective, and the lower buildings were designed to meet the local prevailing energy code in the suburbs. Additionally, we designed the infrastructure around the city, so we created, I should go back to this one. We actually created this community using ArcGIS. We created the roads, we created the infrastructure under the roads, so the potable water, the sewage, the storm water, and what have you. And I'd just like to give a shout out to Halverson and Partners, who helped with the structural engineering, Arup, who did the civil engineering, and Positive Energy Practice, who helped us with the mechanical systems in the buildings. So, this was a collaborative effort to try to design these things to really allow us to hone in on the differences. So these 2 buildings were designed in the manner that I showed you. They were designed with approximately a 70% glazing ratio, because the reality is that these buildings of this height are not going to have punched windows. These 3 typologies here were basically extruded buildings with podium parking. These have parking below grade. These would have parking and car parking in the podium, and that's something to remember when we're making the comparison later. Again, these have quite a high window wall ratio. Then moving into these these 2 low-rise typologies, they were much lower window wall ratio in the 20% kind of range, and then we have the suburban homes, the results. So let's get to the meat of the whole study. So we undertook energy modeling. We built these things in Design Builder and tested them with Energy Plus. My colleague wanted me to point this out so that everybody realized just how long it takes to do an energy model. Anybody who says, oh, we don't run real-time energy simulations, you've got to be living in a kind of different planet to us, because we take 152 hours to do a single energy model on a tower this big. It's a huge undertaking. We ran them in all 4 orientations to follow the Appendix G model. And this is the kind of results we ended up with. So, and you can see right away there's a huge difference. Just the charts are completely different. And there's a lot of, it's kind of obvious to an extent. These buildings have transfer floors, they have high-speed elevators, they have below-grade parking. There's a lot of reasons why the energy demand would be a lot lower there. It's also interesting just to see this kind of information. You know, anybody who's trying to justify why you should reduce water demand in a building only needs to look at the fact that 60% of the energy demand of a prototypical super tall tower is pumping water up the building, and then it comes down by gravity. I mean, there's an obvious opportunity there where you might want to do some other things. The courtyard walk-up obviously doesn't have elevators. Well, not obviously, but in this design, it did not have elevators. And of course, the things like water pumping goes away because it can just use street pressure. So the next 4 charts I'm going to show you are the energy results for all of the typologies. And so I'm looking at it from 2 perspectives. One is the total energy demand of the entire community, and the second series of charts is going to be the energy use intensity, which is a more common metric that you could probably get your head around. So this was using the market kind of sized apartments, and when we normalize it to 150, it actually looks like it's changed dramatically, but the result's the same. The 2 super talls are very high, the 3 extrusions are here, and then the rest are there. So it's kind of not too dissimilar. What's really changed is the suburban house improved considerably, because obviously the area went down from 200 square meters to 150, so it's improved a lot. Looking at energy use intensity, so this is the kilowatt hours per square meter per year. We see a much more interesting figure, especially when we come to this number. And this is really, it's kind of easy to figure out why these differences exist. And I've just summarized it very simply here. Firstly, these buildings have a very high glazing ratio. They're going to take a knock on from the heating requirements, and the cooling requirements are going to be increased because of that. They have a huge pumping energy demand. People don't want to crawl up a super tall building slowly, so it's got high-speed elevators with transfer floors. It's got a car park that has to be heated and cooled. These buildings, on the other hand, have podium car parking, no need for heating and cooling of that. The elevators can be a little bit slower. They don't have the transfer floors. These buildings are more efficient than those buildings. These buildings are more efficient than those buildings. What this is, effectively, is a study in building efficiency. I want to talk about transport very quickly. Transportation is really the elephant in the room for our study. It's the known unknown. We simply couldn't really address it. There's only one thing that we could do comfortably with transport. The transport emissions of a dense community, you would expect that it's going to attract public transport. On the other hand, suburbs, people are going to have to commute somewhere. Our problem is we don't know where they're going to commute to, so making any kind of assumptions is always going to be fraught with issues, so we've kind of left it to one side. But there's one thing that we were confident about, and it's your good old garbage delivery, garbage collection and postal delivery. And this is just an interesting thing. If I'm living in a super tall building, the UPS guy comes once a day, twice a day maybe. The garbage truck probably comes once a day, maybe even once every other day. Here, it's the same kind of thing, but he visits every single house. He travels more than 80 kilometers around to collect waste from 2,000 homes. It's a long distance that he's traveling. So this is the carbon dioxide emissions in tons per year, just for the transportation effects that we know about. I'm going to talk very, very quickly about the land use. This is kind of obvious, but it's very, very important to point out. The 2,000 homes in the suburbs occupy almost 300 hectares, 296 hectares. A single super tall tower occupies 27 hectares. That's a huge difference. What can you do with that land? You can only imagine. And this is the results of, if we look at land use of the super tall towers as a function of of the suburban thing, we can see that it's really, it really jumps only once you start moving into housing. All of the tower typologies use a very, very, very small proportion of the land of a suburban development. And this is just it shown graphically. You can see there's a huge opportunity here. Right, finally I want to get into talking about carbon, because that's what we've tried to pull everything back to. It's the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to talk about the entire life cycle carbon of these communities. And so for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to very quickly say that life cycle carbon is the carbon dioxide emissions associated with every single step of the life cycle of a material. So everything from extraction, transportation, manufacture, construction, operation and maintenance, and end of life, and either recycling or disposal. Anytime there's a carbon dioxide emission, whether it's from transport or from somebody doing something, burning it, whatever, it's included in this study. For our study, we were not really able to look at the end of life or building operations. So we really focus on this, and just, you know, in case you're interested, we used we took emissions factors from the Bath ICE database, so everything was standardized. We used the Portland Cement Association of North America for the cement stuff, and the Pipe Manufacturers Association of the UK for the embodied carbon of the pipe networks. And this is how it all stacks up. The embodied carbon of the building, we broke it up into the infrastructure aspect and the actual building itself. And it's very small in the super tall. Just remember this number, 504 tons. I'm talking about the infrastructure emissions. Actually, you should remember both numbers, because the building is also very, very high. But infrastructure in the suburban development is absolutely massive. It's a huge amount. It's 40 times greater. And when we plot all of this out on a chart, you can see the proportion of, well, firstly, the overall chart tells you the tons of carbon dioxide associated with the life cycle of the building. And the red bars is the embodied carbon of the building, and the blue bars the infrastructure. And you can see very clearly that the percentages just tell the story for you. Now, when we look at carbon emissions, we tend to look at them, we want to look at the life cycle carbon emissions, so now we have to add the operational CO2 emissions to this. And this would be how it stands in the first year of construction, with the embodied carbon being very, very high and the operational carbon being low. But that's not how you do it. You would normally look over a much longer life period. And what we chose was a 40-year life period to look at the life cycle carbon dioxide emissions of the typologies. I picked 40 years because that's typically when a facade on a building would start failing significantly to the point that you would want to do a major replacement. And I really didn't want to get into including operational and maintenance carbon dioxide in my story. So we focused on this. And you can still see that the courtyard building is coming out the best. It came out best in terms of energy demand, and it's coming out best in terms of embodied carbon. The super talls are quite poor, unfortunately. You can see here, what we often see is the ratio of embodied carbon to life cycle, to carbon dioxide emissions, and how long it takes to pay back. So it's not until the building's 11 and a half years old that the operational emissions actually exceed the embodied carbon emissions. But it's not just about the buildings. I told you before about, look at the amount of land we've saved. So what if we actually factor the land into this? Imagine that I take all of the land that I've saved from not building 2,000 homes on it, and that's my blue chart, and I put photovoltaics on. We worked with Positive Energy Practice to design a proper PV farm, so it's not some kind of, in every single square meter of the place is covered with PVs. It was designed, it takes into account soiling factors, temperature from the climate and what have you. This is how much energy I can generate how much carbon dioxide I can offset through generating renewable energy. That's the blue chart. Now what I've done is So that's in my bank. That's in my back pocket. Now what I've done is out of my wallet, I've started to take some carbon dioxide from the 20-year embodied carbon, and sorry, I picked 20 years for this because that's the warranty period of PV farms, basically. So I've kind of used a different year. But if we take away the energy that I've started to use, you can see here's what's left. And this is where it's really interesting, because the picture suddenly changes. So suddenly my courtyard building is no longer the most efficient, but actually the extruded super tall buildings are the most efficient typology. They leave the most, yes, they're not awesome from an energy consumption perspective, but the fact that you save so much land gives you that great opportunity. And so we decided to just play with that whole notion of, okay, what do we do with the remaining land? And so this little chart here, even more complicated than the last one, but what we have here is, okay, so let's just become energy positive. We're generating enough power on our spare land to become energy positive. That's these two, offsetting the operational and the embodied. This one allows 105 square meters. This addresses Anthony's concern about open space. A very good metric for open space in Chicago would be 105 square meters per person. That's this. This leaves that amount of land. But depending on who I am, it can produce crops for this percentage of the population, 3 to 7%. So I think what's interesting about this is you can't just look at the embodied carbon of a building or the life cycle of the building. You have to start looking at what the bigger picture, and you know, what is the big answer? Which is the best building typology? I'm going to go on record as saying I believe it's the extruded buildings, the tallest you can get in a simple extrusion, that gives you the most efficiency of land use. But there's a little bit more work to be done.